This is Family Ghost, and we're live on the air with Alexa Nazzaro for the first time. How are you doing tonight?
Hello. Good. How are you doing?
Oh, it's always great to talk to new people. And we want to also mention that we are a featured podcast on Newsly. You can see that icon listed on Newsly. And if you use the coupon code GHOST, you get 1 month free premium subscription so you can stop scrolling and start listening. Newsly takes podcasts and articles and sets alerts. So your favorite podcast, you can go and set it up so you can hear it. We are a featured podcast on Newsly. We will be on there later tonight with this episode. And also, for those of you who are audio only listeners, we want to give the website that we're actually showing on the video podcast. So Aaxel Author Services, to spell it out, that's AAXEL authorservices.com. And if somebody goes there, what do they find?
They will basically find information about self-publishing, about writing, as well as our services related to helping authors navigate all of those stages of the author experience, I guess.
That's always good to know. We'll probably repeat it again later in that podcast. We do a mid, you're not on the video podcast. And again, thank you for being on the Family Ghost podcast. So you are the founder of Aaxel Author Services, and that's an agency that provides authors with turnkey support and editing, book design, and marketing. And you've worked with over 100 authors in the U.S., Canada, and Europe, and Australia, all genres. And so that sounds really cool. And as a poet and a musician and a producer, I actually started when I was in college. I actually self-published poetry books, but I probably wasn't as successful because I didn't know who to go to. I just kind of just did it and got on NPR and went on radios and trying to push it. But yeah, we can talk about like the whole process today is a lot. That was back in like 86.
Oh my gosh, so you were a real pioneer.
Limited in what I could do.
Yes.
Today you have a lot more tools. So maybe you can talk about, well, I'll ask you one of the first questions. Like, I guess for somebody who's going to write, like, how do you write a good book? And then how do you actually self-publish that book?
So I would say that when it comes to writing a good book, I mean, there are so many different ways to do that. I mean, we could have a whole hour-long podcast discussion just on how to write a good book. Some people are really into planning a book, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. So they're, we call them plotters. If we're talking about fiction, people who really sit down and they figure out, who are my main characters? What's the conflict? Where is my story taking place? And really mapping out the whole trajectory of the story. And you could do the same thing for nonfiction. What's your subject? How are you going to break that subject down into different chapters? Do the chapters flow naturally one into the other? So that's usually, in my experience, the most effective approach. But there are people who will just say, I'm just going to sit down and write, and they'll just write out their first draft, and then they'll go back to revising. So I would say there are two different approaches. What I always tell authors, though, is don't write with publishing in mind. Like, yes, you want to obviously create and craft a book that meets your target reader's needs and expectations, but you don't want to get into this just with this expectation and pressure of selling thousands of copies, which nobody's against, but you want to start from a good place. You want to start from a sincere, genuine place that really boils down to just a desire to write something that can connect with readers.
Well, I think it's like the same thing with a musician. Like if you target the top 10 or the top 20, then you're going to end up like cloning existing stuff, right? You're not going to be your authentic self. And as a producer, I always tell other musicians, like, that shouldn't be your goal. He's like, I'd rather listen to your demo of you just being honest and then try to make that sound like the best you, right? Instead of trying to make it sound like Taylor Swift or some other top 10 person, right? And then radically changing you. I rather present the best you, because that's your best bet, because your authentic self, your unique vision can
Absolutely.
actually reach a lot of people. And it's
Yeah,
just like how you get that through your producer, your editor, your recording engineer, your other fellow artist. So
right.
do you help with like the writing groups, or, you know, like a lot of authors I've talked to have like trusted groups of people, either trusted readers or
Hmm.
these groups that they
Yeah.
go and they connect with. Does your service connect with people that help authors find that group of people to help them with their vision?
So we can certainly help guide them if they're looking for a critique group or for beta readers. One of the services that we offer, well, we offer two services to help people who are still in the writing process. One of them is essentially like a manuscript planning, a book planning service where we sit down with someone. We meet authors all the time, especially in nonfiction, it seems, where they are an expert in their field. They have a particular
Mhm.
subject they want to explore, but it's all in their heads. And it's one thing to know something, it's another thing to write it. So they need some help in how to map that out. So we definitely offer that service. And we also offer what we call manuscript evaluations. So these are for people who are in the process of writing their draft, or more often than not, people who have finished their first draft and they just can't look at it anymore. And they want to have an experienced eye reading the manuscript and really dissecting that manuscript. What are its strengths? Where is there room for improvement? And with a game plan on how to get the manuscript to the next level. So
Mhm.
that is a little different from beta readers, because you were talking about groups of readers. So beta readers, their task is not so much necessarily to go and provide an in-depth analysis. Typically,
Mhm.
you want to get beta readers who are fans of your genre. So if you've written fantasy, it only makes sense to find beta readers who love fantasy, and they'll give you just their gut reaction, just their real honest feedback on whether this is a book they would go and buy, what makes it good, what makes it not so good. So those are beta readers. Our manuscript evaluation service, I guess, is a bit of a it's a bit of a beta readership on steroids in a way, like just really giving more of a deep dive into the assessment of the manuscript.
So that sounds like a good set of services, because a lot of times, you know, as a musician, you know, we have like similar to writing groups. We'll have like, you know, like big collectives of musicians or people who are into your genre, or we have places like SoundCloud, so we can actually send demos to places like that and then gauge like demo versions of our songs and see what the reaction to people in certain genres like EDM, electronic trance, and we can get like diehard fans of those genres to actually say, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And they'll actually go in and say, I like 1 minute 36. I like
Nice.
this part. They'll go and give very detailed
Yeah.
assessments, and it's free. You just send
Yeah.
it out to that area, and then people will give you feedback. And so that's kind of cool. But I guess the question when you get into like whether you should self-publish or get like a publisher, it seems like a lot of people, because of the age of Amazon and everything, it is the trend more self-publishing or try to actually present it depending on the work. Like if you critique a work and you look at it, would you recommend it to go to the traditional publishers, or you always recommend like self-publishing?
So for me, whether to go traditional or indie, to me does not hinge so much on the quality of the manuscript. It really hinges more on the personality of the author. There are some authors for whom they just want that traditional publishing deal. They want to get the agent, they want the agent to
Mhm.
shop around their manuscript, and they want to sign that traditional deal. And I respect that. And I've worked with authors who just want to get their manuscript up to a certain level, but already
Mm.
knowing going into the process, independent publishing, self-publishing isn't for them. And I think it's
Mhm.
really important to know oneself, because at the end of the day, if you're publishing yourself, you're it. You have to be ready to go out there. You have to embrace the creative process. You have to be ready to be a part of all of that. Even if you work with a publishing partner like Aaxel Author Services, you're not just handing everything over to us and just waiting for the royalties to start
Yeah, you
coming
gotta
in. I
participate.
mean, you're participating, and not every author wants to do that. Some authors still really want that traditional publishing contract. So I really don't find it actually has anything to do with quality writing. It really has more to do with who are you as a writer. And if you're not interested in being that kind of entrepreneur with your writing and with your author career, then really self-publishing is probably just going to be a lot more stressful and unenjoyable. So maybe just don't do it. So, and I speak very frankly about that. And by the same token, when I point out the disadvantages of trying to get a traditional publishing deal, I'm not stating things just because I want to get more authors onto the Aaxel Author Services train. I'm saying it because it's just a reality. The fact of the matter is, it's increasingly difficult to get traditionally published, certainly from one of the big publishers. It's just, it's always that catch-22, you know, established publishers. This is a business, so they have to live within the reality of that business model. So, you know, are they willing to take on a brand new unknown author? They're going to be more reluctant to do that. So it's just much harder. And the other thing too that needs to be pointed out with traditional publishing, many publishers, they don't want unsolicited manuscripts directly from writers. And that's where the agent comes in. And getting an agent can be like a 3, 4, 5-year process because agents themselves are inundated with requests. So you have to be in it for the long haul if you want to be traditionally published.
It seems like it's very difficult because the gatekeepers, like even in the music industry, the way things are, because you have the TikTok, because you have shorts, because you have social media, you can reach audiences that the gatekeepers wouldn't even let you get to. And so you can have people that would have never got signed, right, by a traditional record company, can actually get millions of fans outside of that machine. And then they're like, they'll come to you because you actually triggered that through TikTok or Instagram or Facebook. You did that. So it seems like you have to engage. Like a lot of us independent musicians, we have to constantly post on Instagram. We have to constantly run reels. We have to be willing to go and do interviews. We have to go and do shows. We got to be willing. So if you're the type of person you just want to create it and then let somebody else take care of it, maybe trying to be an indie person might not work because you do have to have that business hat on. And if you're just creative hat, without any business sensibilities, you're never going to get it in the market.
Absolutely. And I mean, something else that needs to be pointed out, you were talking about gatekeepers. I still find there's still, I mean, and this has to be honestly spoken about, that indie publishing, there is still that stigma in the traditional publishing world. And you see it all the time when you want to submit your book for awards. Very often, especially if it's an established award, they'll basically say no self-published, no self-published authors. So there are still very much those gatekeepers in the literary world. And so you have to go into independent publishing knowing that you also have to explore all of those alternative routes that you were just talking about, engaging on. So you have to hustle, basically. You've got to get on social media. You've got to create your own author events. You've got to build a mailing list. I mean, different marketing techniques work for different authors. So not every author is interested or comfortable with doing podcasts, and that's totally fine. So at Aaxel Author Services, we're not about trying to force one recipe on every author because not everything works for everyone. So it's all about customization. But one thing remains a fact is you have to engage and you have to really be committed to your author career.
It seems like the podcast, at least for me, I've been doing this in 2016, and we started only with musicians. And then we expanded to poets, and then we expanded to authors, and we expanded to filmmakers, and now we talk to CEOs, shamans, life coaches, therapists. And what we found is like the same way our music is, we call our music expansive. So we're kind of cross genre. We do jazz, we do fusion, we do punk, we do EDM, we do all kinds of things. And a lot of people say, well, you've got to be narrowly focused, because if you're not narrowly focused, then you won't work. But I found the opposite. I mean, I've been doing this podcast since 2016, and I had a narrow focus that's expanded way beyond the narrow focus. So the question is, like, I guess when you're a writer, you're in your genre, right? So if you're a romance writer, you're probably not going to write science fiction. You're probably
No,
not going to do nonfiction unless you're just multi-talented and you have different hats in all of these different things.
right. Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, because that's how I feel also about Aaxel Author Services. Is I've had people in the past say, well, why don't you just zero in, if you do a lot of children's books, maybe you should just exclusively do children's books. And it's something I've constantly thought about over the years, should I narrow my genre? But I just love the variety. I think the variety is really enriching, and you probably can relate to that, just, connecting with different people. And I feel the same way. And I would say for my authors, most authors I work with do tend to just work in one genre. But if they come to me and say, Alexa, I've been doing children's, but I really want to work on a nonfiction or whatever. I think, again, if it comes from a genuine place and you're doing it not because you're thinking of adding revenue streams, but just because you really would like to write a book in another genre, well, then go for it,
That's why I've heard some other authors that what they proposed is this kind of thing where you get to have somebody that's actually like published, right?
Right.
But they're a romance author. And then they got this science fiction idea and they said, well, my publisher, I'm published, but they're never going to publish my sci-fi story. They're just not into it. So
Yeah.
I'll go independent for that because I want to do it. And I said, I'm going to go and do it, maybe even do it under a pseudonym or something. But it's like they find a way to indie publish or self-publish things that maybe they couldn't because of their identity as an author,
Right.
because they're associated with this brand or this set
Yeah.
of IP. Yeah. So do you find that? Do people come to you? Do you ever get that kind of situation?
Yes, I mean, definitely that does happen. And this is, I think, sometimes where also pen names can come into play, although that also can start creating some confusion. You have one name for your romance novels, let's say, you've got another name for your children's books. So that can become quite a bit too, to juggle at one time. Yeah, it really can. I would say for now, most of our authors have generally stuck to one genre, or their other book just kind of feeds in. For instance, we were working with an author who's he's quite known in Silicon Valley in the field of artificial intelligence, and he wrote a memoir about growing up in Iran and coming to the United States. And his other book is a sci-fi novella set in the near future, and there are natural links between the two. And so that makes it easier. When it's really two different genres, that can be a little trickier, no doubt.
Yeah. Because, I guess when in the beginning, like Stephen King had a pseudonym and he used to do things under that, but, and it's kind of known. Like some people will do it, but yeah. And even like, in the music industry, Prince would go and create like pseudonyms and actually show up on other people's names as Camille or some other name, or like it was just like like, okay, why is he doing that? Because he knew everybody knew his sound,
Right.
and he wanted to be working on something else without people automatically thinking it was him.
Right.
And so it's like it's a strategy when you do that, if you want to actually do something and not draw attention to it and just let it stand on its own feet as something different, because you have all that overhead kind of known with your name.
Right.
But so I guess the other question is like about how to protect yourself from a vanity publisher. What's the strategy for doing that?
So what I always tell authors is, yes, our business thrives on hype. It's just the way it is, because I think anytime you have an industry that is working with people's dreams, and most people who come to us, even the most level-headed entrepreneurs or life coaches, this is a little bit of a dream for them, and dreams make us vulnerable, and they can make us vulnerable to people who want to exploit that desire to be on a bestseller list and whatever else. So what I find very often is, yes, there are dishonest businesses out there in our field, but it's also really important that an author truly equip themselves with the knowledge so that when they sign a contract, they know exactly what they're getting. So for instance, we have authors who sometimes contact us and say, well, I published with so-and-so, but now they're not doing anything to market my book. Well, did you think, had you understood that they were going to do that? Because if they did, then that makes sense. Yeah, you really should go back and say, hey, I paid for this. Why aren't you doing this? But very often I find authors just go into these contracts not really understanding what they're doing. So for instance, with book design, are you getting a customized book design from scratch, or is the company working off a template and maybe you won't be so impressed with the cover design that you get? These are really important questions so that you're not disappointed. And sometimes in these contracts, they will use language that the average person doesn't understand. So a lot of authors will think, oh, well, they said that they would distribute my book to hundreds of book retailers. And the author might think, well, those are bookstores, right? Like those are real physical bookstores. But no, they're not. What they're doing is they're using exactly. But you see here, yes, maybe the business, the company wasn't so forthcoming, but maybe the author didn't take the time to really ask the questions so that they could gather all the knowledge necessary.
Yeah. Also, I think it's important. Like if you're in the music world today, our payment skills from streaming are super low.
Okay.
So we have to do what we call sync licensing, right? So what happens is we go and take our song, we get it into films, video games, advertising, movies, different places. We might license TikTok, or we'll license it on Twitch. So video gamer, I actually signed like a BMI contract to have my songs on Twitch, so video gamers can use it legally, and then I get paid a commission that's actually higher than what I would get on Spotify. And so that's where the money is in different places. It's almost like Spotify and Apple are like the radio.
Right.
They allow us to get booked, but they don't really pay us. Right. So so in the book world, do you help with like determining like the reproduction rights, the film rights, the screenplay rights, the film rights, all those type of rights that an author might not fully understand when they get into it?
So we can certainly give them information. It's not really our area of expertise. And I will say that particularly with film rights, there has been a plethora of companies that have emerged over the last couple of years. You know, Netflix and all of these streaming services, they're looking for content. So we can get your book and we can get it in front of producers and, you know, agents and whatever else. And it's so important really to measure what does that really mean? Because there are a lot of, if we're talking about scammers, there's a great blog actually that I recommend all indie authors check out. It's called Writer Beware. And it's a great blog. And basically what this woman does is she simply puts out warnings about the latest scam, the latest fraud that is targeting. And really, I find especially this whole turning your book into a movie or a TV show for Netflix, I see these offers coming in all the time. So we really have to be careful, and authors need to understand.
Yeah. What's real and what's a scam? Because, you know, you get these guys coming from who knows where, sending these pitches, send you emails, send you whatever. They get your name, and then they act like there's some, and it happens like in the music industry. You know, we get people then suddenly send you a contract. And if you don't read it, they end up doing an 80-20. Where like they get 80, you get 20. And like that's like a no-brainer. Like, no, you shouldn't sign that. Exactly. It's kind of like for musicians, like back in the day, like Hendrix would sign everything just because he wanted to play, which is typical of a musician. He just want to play. And then he ended up having so many legal problems for his family after he passed because he signed everything he could just to be able to play. And then there's all these people own the rights to everything.
Yes.
And then you're like, and so you got to be very careful. I would think it's the same thing with like literature or content. If you're a creator and you create something that's content worthy, it could be turned into a video game. It could be turned into a movie or a film or a screenplay or something.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean that those opportunities don't exist, but just really be aware, because you just have to be aware, because it's really, really important. I find that people know that is, and especially the whole Netflix getting your book in front of producers, it's a huge thing. And another area that I find a lot of scams happen is contests. Anyone can start up a book, you know, a writing contest and submit your book, and there'll be a $125 fee, you know, to get your book. But how known is this contest? How established are they? And this is homework that you have to look into. And most times, and I find with authors, especially my authors, after they're published, they just start getting inundated with these offers of this, that, and the other. I can tweet your book to my 50,000 followers. Well, find out who this person is. Are they usually tweeting about makeup, about plastic surgery? I mean, it has to make sense. So just don't fall for every single offer.
What do you think about the new AI marketing? There's like tons of stuff coming in. Like for musicians, we're getting hit with AI marketing, AI production tools, and all of them have tons of fees.
Yeah.
All of them are kind of grabbing like potentially copyrighted material.
Yeah.
Right. And then potentially putting you at legal jeopardy because they're grabbing other people's work without citing it or paying them.
Right.
And then you don't know what you know, and then you don't know what the profit schemes are. And a lot of times it's not really clear, and you need a lawyer to look at the contract, because then suddenly you might have given license to your material.
Right.
And then it suddenly gets in that whole metaverse.
Yeah.
And then people are using your stuff, and then you're not getting paid for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no, it's something to definitely be careful of and wary of. One of the things that's interesting for me is also writers using these AI tools to write their first draft, for instance. I mean, it's becoming really robust. And one of the things that I always recommend is, at the end of the day, at least for manuscripts, just write it yourself. Like, I think there's this organic experience that can only come with actually writing it yourself. That being said, I mean, sometimes these tools are really robust. So certainly for marketing materials, it might help, but I always recommend, you use that as a first draft, but then you have to go in and really put in your authentic voice and your authentic spin to it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Cause I get afraid of, so much AI created content, and it gets so good that it's really kind of like the AI ghost wrote it,
Yes, absolutely. No, it's crazy. I mean, we actually we tested it once for a book synopsis, and we said, wow, for a first draft, we were just curious more than anything. We always do our stuff from scratch. But it certainly brings into question, okay, so integrity, artistic integrity, right? And who's really behind well, at least in our case, the written word. And so we believe in the integrity of the written word, but of course, technology can't be ignored either. So.
Yeah, it's just difficult because, like, being a musician, I'm a keyboardist. Okay. So I really don't want AI writing my melody line or my chord progressions.
No, of course.
Because that's kind of like, I know how to do it. Like, but I can see if you're somebody that doesn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
But then the problem is that what I've seen it do is it lifts pieces from tons of work. And potentially you run into the sampling problem that a lot of artists ran into, where you could get in trouble with somebody saying you actually use this song, and all the lawyers come after you because you've got clips of all the people's ideas. And the same thing could happen with like existing properties if that's what AI does, and that's kind of what it does. It kind of scans the world looking for things, and it might grab and lift things. And somebody say, hey, you lifted an idea right out of my book.
Yes, absolutely. No, you have to definitely be careful about that. One of the other things that this sort of goes off on a little bit of a different subject is even book cover design. So this is where sometimes you have to differentiate the services you're getting, because if you're working with somebody who tends to use a lot of templates, and this has happened plenty of times where it's the same stock photo on several book covers, and that is who wants to be, so this is why, like, a highly cookie cutter, like, who wants cookie cutter? You want something that's highly customized, so that you're not one of those authors who says, oh, I think I just saw that girl on someone else's book cover, but that's on my book cover too. Oh my gosh, it's happened. It's really embarrassing. It's happened, not to us, but it's happened.
Well, that's one of the things I heard from an author I interviewed, was that when you're with like the publishers, even the indie publisher, they kind of control what the book design is going to be. Either the author can kind of say what they want, but a lot of times they say, we know better.
Okay.
And then they override what the author wants. And a lot of times when the author goes indie, they're able to get the cover they want.
Absolutely. 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 Well, that's one of the advantages. I always tell authors there are two key advantages to being an independent, to being an indie author. One of them is complete creative control. So for instance, if you're doing it on your own, then ultimately all the final decisions go back to you. In our case, we consider ourselves a publishing partner. So we're here to stand alongside the author as they go through the creative process. We will always give our own opinions. We will only propose design concepts, for example, that we feel look professional and look right for the author and their book. But ultimately, the author has a voice, because I always tell authors at the end of the day, I want you to look at the book that we helped you produce and it feels like it's your book. Like if you had done it on your own and you had the entire skill set necessary, this is the book that you would have ended up with, not a book that was imposed on you by someone else. So it's really, really important to have that creative control. And we're very proud of that at Aaxel Author Services. I mean, it's not about templates. We start every author starts with a blank canvas, and let's build your book and let's build your author brand and whatever else you might be interested in.
One of the other things when I was talking to another author, they said, they were with a publisher, and let's say they had 120,000 word count. And then the company came back and said, no, that's got to be like 66,000. That's it.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, what does that do to the book?
Yeah.
They just come in. Then that's the same thing with a musician. Like you got a 4 minute and 52-second song. And you as the artist say, that's the complete thought. And the record company says, cut that down to 232. And you're like, well, you're missing the whole thing, because it really kicks in halfway through and then you cut it off. And
but it's so interesting, because I have a lot of authors who, they seem really preoccupied with word count. Oh, Alexa, I think like a novel, maybe 70,000 words, 75,000 words. And I always tell authors, just write the story that needs to be written. We can always look it over, because look, I mean, honestly, there are definitely a lot of authors who just get caught up in detail, and all of a sudden, maybe their book is 15 to 20,000 words more than it needs to be. But we work with authors who write books of all lengths. I mean, we're currently working with an author. Her book is about 150,000 words, but you know what? Every word of that counts. So there is a reality, and there's no doubt about it. Are people going to be less willing to take a chance on a new book if it's a really long book, like 500-600 pages? Maybe. But if you've written a really good book and you find the right readers, because it's all about finding the right readers, they're going to be so grateful for those 500-600 pages. So it all starts with the writing. Don't already box yourself into a product that has a set of standards. Just be yourself, and then we can always look things over afterwards.
That's the idea what I have with music, because a lot of times, like this, what I call is you serve the song. So serving the song says, okay, the industry says, our people say the song's got to be 2 minutes and 50 seconds, 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Right.
But I write a song that's 5 minutes. And it's kind of experimental, right? And so maybe you don't get it because you can't find a template, right? And that's the problem. A lot of times with creative people, like, you're trying to put me in a box, but I did something that's out the box. And so, of course, if people look at it to go to market it, well, that doesn't fit in the current boxes.
Right.
So how am I going to market it? But the way I look at it, if you look at the whole world, and you don't get a narrow focus, maybe you're only looking at EDM, but this thing's like psytrance, or this thing's like, this thing's progressive.
Right.
Or this is more like a flashback to new wave.
Right.
So it could be that long. And
Absolutely.
so you're missing a boat. So if somebody has something and they hit like 120,000, you're saying, oh, it's supposed to be 75.
Yeah.
And people get so stuck on it. It's got to be 75 because that's what they're running their numbers and
they're exactly. Oh yeah. I mean, you Google how long should a book be? You'll get so many responses. But I sometimes also find authors in the opposite, with the opposite problem, is they feel their book isn't long enough. It's like, I don't know, I mean, this book is 27,000 words, but if I read it and I say, you know what? You've said what you have to say. Why stretch things out and then risk really compromising the quality of your book just because you want it to hit 35,000, 40,000 words. No, don't look at it that way.
But if you think about it, like I'm into Victorian poets and I love William Blake.
Okay.
And if you look at William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience and compared to like Tennyson or Wordsworth or Longfellow, it's very short, right? But he's still considered one of the greatest Victorian poets. And so you can't really measure William Blake
No,
by the length of the
no,
work. It's
no,
the
exactly.
quality and the feel of the work. And so you could have something that could be just as powerful as like the Songs of Innocence and Experience and very short.
Hmm.
And people say, well, it needs to be like the Odyssey, or it needs to
Yeah.
be like the Iliad,
Yeah.
or, and it's
Right.
like, oh, no, that's not what it is. It's something else.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's exactly how I feel. So it's just the work speaks for itself. So if you've said everything you want to say and your novel, yeah, okay, so your novel is 23,000 words. Well, you know what? It's good. It's good the way it is, because nothing is worse than trying to force something creative
Yeah,
into a
you're right.
product. I've never seen it work out really in the end.
Yeah, it's like when I see certain producers that what they do is they have a method, and the method will hit that target audience because basically what they're doing is they're using the same clips, the same samples, the same drums,
Mhm.
the same pads, the same plugins, right?
Yeah.
And they have a method to their madness because they're a co-writer and they're getting commission by the reuse of those patterns,
Right.
right? So they'll go reuse them because they get money by
Of course.
reusing them, and then they put them into everybody, and then
Yeah.
everybody has the same sound. Right?
Right.
So then you've got to be wary of people who have a kind of vested interest in kind of replicating or kind of overdoing the genre or overdoing the same style over and over because they actually make money from doing it.
Right. Right.
So I think you have to decide, like, if you're a very author, like you said at the beginning, you do it because you love it. Like musicians, we
Yes.
do it because we love it. And if
Yeah.
we happen to get gigs and we happen to get this, it's because we love playing, right?
Yeah.
And then we
Right.
find it kind of comes to us because we're passionate about it and we're dedicated and we're continuing. And if you continue your craft, you tend to be able to find an audience. The audience will find you.
I totally agree. What I always say, and this is what I live by really, is if you've written something that is important enough to you, you will find someone or other people who will find it important to them and it'll resonate with them. So I think I just think it's really important to be invested. And I've seen plenty of authors start out. And every author, once you publish your book, there's that honeymoon period where, oh, your book is out, all your family and friends, everyone you've ever known, they've bought their copy, and you might even have like a book launch or whatever. And that good feeling, that high sort of lasts about maybe 2 months. But then the work begins, because now suddenly you want to find people beyond your family and friend circle. And that
Yeah.
takes work, and you have to be in it for the long haul. And I have seen authors they ride that wave for a couple of months and then they lose stamina, they lose their momentum. Whereby I have other authors who've kept at it. But yeah, sometimes it takes about a year, 18 months before you start seeing the results from that. But you need to be consistent. No matter how you market your book, you have to do it consistently.
Yeah, you have to engage because
Yeah.
a lot of times the artistic type of person was like, well, I finished it, I'm going to work in the next one.
Yeah.
But like if you're going to self-publish, you have to market that
Right.
last one. You just
Yes.
can't keep on working on the next one to the next one, and then you
Yeah.
just do that, and then you're like, well, that's going to just make money. Well, no, it won't make money. It won't get anywhere unless you put time into it.
Absolutely. But I will say that there's definitely a school of thought in our industry that states you need to have more than one book out there to really make it as an indie author. And I think there's some truth to that, because especially in certain genres. So for instance, if you've written a fantasy book and you find a nice pool of readers who really like your
They're going to
story,
want the next one.
they're going to want the next one. So if you're just a one book wonder and that's all you've got for a few years, it's going to be harder to keep that fan base, to
Yeah, they
maintain that
want
fan
the
base.
next
They
one.
want more. On the
More
other
sequels.
hand, they want a sequel, or they want at least another story in the same genre. So if you're not offering that, yeah, people can lose interest, they can tune out. On the other hand, I have met authors who are just, they take that way too literally, and all they're doing is pushing out more books, and they're writing and writing. But okay, now you're up to book 7 or 8. I think you should take a break and try to market these books.
Yeah, because that's the problem with like musicians. Like sometimes we get into creative zones, and you just want to write. You just want to, you just want to write.
That's great. That's great. That's wonderful.
But it's like you can't just keep writing without finding like a venue. You need a
gotta
venue.
Go out there. Yeah.
You got to get in front of people, and you know, people don't always want to hear your new stuff. You know, so you've got to build up like at least a kind of repertoire that you can do as a show, like, so that people are going to get familiar with. And the only way you sometimes you have to slow down. You know,
absolutely.
That's always hard. I think that's a hard thing for some people, because it's like, if you got like this, like it just keeps on going. You get this, it just won't stop. With some artists, you know, they continually get ideas. And I think authors and musicians are kind of like in that kind of mindset. Like they tend to continually get lots of creative.
For sure.
This flourishing is this happening, and then you kind of like, oh well, how do I manage that? Like, so do you have a particular advice for somebody who's like maybe doing a little too much, or either one? You know, like where to find a balance?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bit of balance. I think it also depends on where you're at. So if you've just launched a book, I would recommend that you spend at least the next 3 to 4 months, 3 to 6 months, really just focusing as much as you can on marketing. I think that's where your energies should be. And then at some point, you know, you want to go back, and you want to go back to the computer or your notepad, and you want to start figuring out your next book. That's great. But you have to always do the minimum. And I always recommend authors figure out what's the minimum. And I think this also goes back to what an author's objective is. Not every author wants to find thousands of readers. Of course, every author would grab that opportunity. If it was just tossed in their lap, nobody would say, no, it's okay, I don't need thousands of readers for my book. But not every author really is ready to expend the energy to do that. And sometimes that doesn't even make sense. If you've written a really niche book, nonfiction particularly, if you have a really, really niche subject, well, maybe you're not even going to find that many readers. So I think it also comes back to your objectives. But I will say one of the other nice things about being an independent author, and I was citing creative control, that also extends to marketing. For instance, in the traditional world, you're only as good as your latest book. And usually the traditional world gives your book about a 3-month lifespan. Something's got to happen in those first 3-4 months, or they drop it, and it goes to your backlist. But what's really great about being an indie author is if you've written a book and it's been 5-6 years, and maybe
you can still push it. Yeah.
You haven't even written anything since, still revive that book. There's nobody telling you, well, that book is in the past. Like you have to, you have to look forward. No, you don't have, you have a lot of options as an indie author.
Yeah, same with music, because you can go, like, if you own your masters and your own material, you can get, like, if you can, because all these different social media, like, let's say you had something 5 years old and you create a TikTok for it or a reel, and it starts going. Like if you were in a traditional record company, you said, well, that's 5 years old, I'm not pushing that. But because you own it, you could actually bring that back and then do a tour on it. And they'd be like, no, you can't do the tour on it. You got to do the new thing. And like, no, you could go and do it. And so that gives you the same flexibility, which I think is a lot of people want that. You know, they want that, they kind of intelligent. And you never know with creativity, it's not always sequential. Sometimes you go back, sometimes you go forward, you go here.
Yeah, absolutely.
You never know where you're going to be. And to have the freedom to say something like, oh, yeah, I really didn't put a good effort into that.
Yes.
And it's actually a really good book. Or it's a really good idea, and I need to actually get this to people. Or something happens in the world where suddenly that becomes more relevant.
Relevant. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Absolutely. Or even you also have the creative control to say, I published this book. I know maybe I did it too quickly. I think it could use a little bit of tweaking. I don't want to give up on it just yet, but I'm not comfortable marketing it the way it is. Well, you know what? You can go back and you can make those modifications and you can relaunch a book. There are so many really nice options that come with being an independent. You're not married to a publisher and you don't have any rules being imposed on you. The only rule you want to live by as an author is to have artistic integrity and to really be passionate about your work and to put in what is required.
Now I'm going to ask a couple other questions because we're getting near the end.
Sure.
That I think are interesting, because the way the world has changed. Is it better to be an Amazon bestseller or to actually be somebody that gets their book into a Barnes and Noble, the physical copy?
So the first thing is definitely being an Amazon bestseller. This is not in any way comparable to being a New York Times bestseller. I see authors all the time saying, I'm an Amazon bestseller. I'm an Amazon international bestseller. That's not to take away from the accomplishment. It's certainly nice to really score a high Amazon ranking in a particular category, but it's not the end all. It's not the goal. It really isn't. It's just a nice to have. In terms of getting into bookstores, this is probably one of the things that I find indie authors are a little disappointed at, because I was telling you earlier about authors who think, oh, well, I've got this publisher, but they're not putting my book in bookstores. Authors really like the idea of having their book in bookstores, but there is a reality that needs to be acknowledged. And that reality is there are so many more books being published every day on Amazon than shelf space at a Barnes and Noble. And Barnes and Noble, they only want to take on books that actually will move. That's their objective. They too are a business. So they're not interested. I mean, shelf space is very precious real estate in the business, in the publishing world. What I recommend and what our authors have a lot of success doing is establishing direct relationships with bookstores and pitching to a bookstore their book. But even Barnes and Noble, they can be really friendly to independent authors. If you build a relationship directly with them, they'll take some books on consignment. Of course, I can't speak for every Barnes and Noble store in the chain, but they will take some books on consignment and they'll put them on their shelf. And you can have that feeling of accomplishment. You have an opportunity to have a reader physically connect with the book, because that's always nice, right? The whole browsing experience, having a reader just look at your book, flip it over. Oh, this sounds interesting. I'll buy this book. That really is, it continues to be really a goal for many indie authors. But I always recommend start directly, nurture those relationships directly, and you can get your book in a Barnes and Noble. And I always recommend try to have a tie-in with an actual author signing, a book event.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask it because a lot of times, I used to live in Northampton, Mass. And a lot of times what people would do is get all these independent stores, and the authors, coming out of Smith and Mount Holyoke and stuff, they would go and, do signings and readings.
Absolutely.
Or independent books coming out, some of the, the young authors coming out of those colleges in the 5 college system. There's a lot of people who are writing. Yeah. And they're actually self-publishing, and then they have a community that's more apt to actually come see them, because they're kind of tied to it. So they would go in these independent stores, and the same thing with the musicians. We go play these independent cafes and then, sell a vinyl or sell a tape.
Yeah, absolutely. And it works.
Sign it. If you're actually there to sign it, then you get more engagement if the author actually signs the work, right?
And it's so interesting because you don't even have to be some authors can be intimidated by the whole book signing experience. Oh, but I'm not really famous. Who's going to care about my book? People love meeting authors. They love picking up a book and talking to the person who wrote it. It really has so much more potential and impact than I think a lot of independent. So don't underestimate going into a bookstore and doing a signing. It can be a really rewarding experience.
And what do you think about getting on like NPR? Like when I first wrote my book, I was able to connect to a couple NPR stations, and and in Maine, in
Hmm.
Northampton, Massachusetts, and different places like in Massachusetts, I was able to get on NPR. And
Right,
back in the day, in '80s, back in the '80s, that's how I was able to do it. And it was just, I just called the station. I was able to
right.
convince them to get on. Now with podcasting,
Yep.
would you still recommend somebody to try to get into like an NPR type of or a or a real radio station, or go on the kind of virtual internet like podcasting route?
I think it depends on the author and their market. I mean, I think that when you target traditional media, it can be magazines, it can be radio stations. I think it just, you have to prove your relevance. Why would this radio station be interested in featuring you? Do
Hmm.
they talk about subjects that are connected to your book? Because nothing is worse, and this also happens with people who are trying to get an agent. They just have this template letter, they have a template pitch, and they really clearly have not done any research on the radio station, on the magazine, on the blog. What kind of books do they feature? What kind of subjects do they explore? I think you just have to be really, really strategic. But I don't think traditional media is dead. I definitely don't. I think podcasting is a wonderfully accessible way for an author to also get their feet wet and get used to being interviewed and having experiences like this, which can also increase your confidence, your ability to talk about your book and about your subject matter. So I think there can be a nice hybrid between the two. And there are still definitely services related to traditional media, putting together a press kit. All of that is still viable and important, provided it makes sense for your book.
Yeah, because how many books can you actually get into the New York Times book review? Like how
Right.
many can they actually will they actually really look at?
Yeah.
But then maybe the fact that you can actually get booked on a podcast,
Yes.
because that's highly probable. And then the other
Absolutely.
question I have is like getting there at the end is audiobooks.
Yes.
Is that really like a very like podcasting to me? It seems to be a really growing area.
Yes. Well, podcasting, sorry, audiobooks, definitely it's a growing market. It's clear. We've certainly done some audiobooks. And interestingly enough, many people enjoy fiction with audiobooks. So there's definitely plenty of room for nonfiction, but fiction audiobooks do really well. And it's definitely not something to be ignored, but I really recommend doing it the right way. And unless you have a professional voice, the fact of the matter is
Actor.
you need to know how to read a book well. And I see a lot of blog posts and a lot of webinars. You can do your own audiobook. I'm certainly not saying you can't, but you don't want to cut corners on this, because I've heard samples of people who've come to me, oh, I've already done the recording. Okay, let's listen to it. And yeah, it sounds like they're recording it in a public bathroom, like all this echo effect, like just really bad. And I'm thinking, no, you need a soundproof studio. This is
You need an
serious. If you
actor. You
want
need
to
a
put
voice
out
actor.
something good. Exactly,
You want a
exactly.
voice
So
actor. You
you
probably wanna hire a voice actor to do that,
absolutely, absolutely.
and a
So
recording engineer.
audiobooks are good, but you don't cut corners. Really don't cut corners for audiobooks.
That's really interesting because, yeah, a lot of what we do in music, they always say, you shouldn't engineer your own record,
Mm,
because engineering is an art. And that's
yes,
the same thing with like a voice actor, in my opinion, because like
absolutely.
acting is an art, and he is, not everybody's Orson Welles,
No.
and not everybody's gonna be able to like do everything. Like sometimes you run into a situation where you could be that type of person
Yes.
that could do
Yes.
everything, but like
Yes.
not everybody can do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I've met authors who have really good voices. They speak with confidence, but they still can't narrate their own book. I mean, it's an art, and you need to either do it really well and be fully equipped, or you hire a voice narrator. And that's what we do. We work with professional narrators.
Well, that's awesome because I think that there's so many things like the book has become multimedia. Like the books, the
Absolutely.
books
Oh,
are
totally.
and podcasting. If you think about it, like in podcast, you could find ways to do excerpts of readings. You could
Yes.
go on, you can at least discuss your book,
Yes.
talk to people, you can put it out there in so many
Yep.
different ways, and there's so many ways to connect in the podcast world. There's
Yep.
just, from audio to video, but I always tell people audio is still bigger than video in podcasting. The
Yes.
audio
Right.
still is the thing that really kicks. The
Mhm.
video is starting to, but it's still the audio, and that's why we always, have multiple forms. And I think
Right.
that's always a good place to think. When you're doing things, you do video, you do audio. You don't just do one form. You do as many forms as you can.
I agree.
But I think we actually got to like the point where I have to leave you because I have another podcast.
No
But I
problem.
do want to let people know that go again to AxelAuthorServices.com. That's AAXEL authorservices.com. And again, you can find all the information about how to contact you and get started with your services. One thing is
Absolutely.
I published my book back in '86. It was a collection of poetry. And just the one question before I leave, like, do you feel poetry is relevant in the self-publishing world today? Do people even read it? And is that something that's like a dead genre for trying to put any effort into?
It's so funny. Poor poets, they're always questioning themselves and their relevance. I mean, I think there's definitely there's room for poetry. But I think again, especially for a poet, you can't be distracted by the noise. You can't be distracted by people saying you're a poet. Who's going to read poetry? There's always an audience for everything. But yeah, I would acknowledge that as a poet, you have to really perhaps have a little bit even more ammunition behind your artistic investment and also just showing up as an author, as a poet. But I'm no, I don't say no to poetry. It's rare that I have poets who come to me and say I want to publish independently, but it's not lost. It's not a lost art form at all, but it's certainly not as common. I would agree, but it's not lost. I would not say that.
Yeah. That's cool because all musicians are kind of poets to begin with,
Yeah,
and
for
then we
sure.
learn how to craft things into lyrics, and then we start to
Absolutely.
wonder, like, "Oh, should I publish my lyrics?" So a lot of musicians, as you get bigger, you
Yeah.
potentially can. You can be like a Dylan. Like
Well, yeah,
if you're writing at
yeah,
the level of a Dylan or a Neil
of course.
Young,
Yes.
you can actually publish because people
Yes.
want to see it.
People
But if
want to
you're
see it.
brand new, you might not be able to do that. It depends how you start to if you start showing up at the coffee houses and the shows
Yes,
and
exactly.
presenting
It
your
all comes
spoken
back
word
to marketing. Yeah, it all comes back
spoken
to
word
marketing
performance.
for
Yeah, spoken word
sure.
performances. Then you make them video
Yeah,
and you do it in that way. You have some kind of presentation. Maybe you can
absolutely.
on the side sell a book with that as part of the whole happening. The idea of like
Exactly.
Andy
There
Warhol
you
back
go.
in the day, he had these happenings across media,
Mhm.
and so that might be their approach to kind of connect to the way the world is today. But
Absolutely. A more creative approach, but I think it's definitely viable.
okay, well, thank you very much for being on the program. And we will be on all major platforms by tomorrow. So thank you again for being on tonight. And we love having guests on the Fam Electric Ghost show. And we had a great time. So hope you did too. And we'll talk to
I
you again
did.
in the future, most likely. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.